I want to thank you for your patience as we try to do this. And as I said, I appreciate the comments of the sister who spoke before me, and her story is familiar to many of us, and the pain is real. And I think when we all reflect on it, we try not to reflect that often on it because it is so extremely painful. You know, I've been asked to just generally talk about, some have asked me to talk about my encounter in California and the kinds of things that I think are extremely important and influence where all of us are. Over the years, I've tried to figure out my family. And when I say figure it out, not so much the details of who's in the family and who's not in the family, but sometimes to try to understand some of the issues that exist and the pain that people feel and the limitations that folks have had over the years. I ran upon a reality that concerning, obviously, my father was a sharecropper and worked in Hope, Arkansas, and had to leave the South because his life was threatened because he was demanding some sense of equity and fairness in Arkansas. And I've often wondered about his father that I knew as a child, who was always sometimes very mean and very much of a disciplinarian, always trying to, very fearful of white people. And I never could understand that as a kid. I couldn't understand it. Now, obviously, his sons that he had eventually all left Arkansas because of the harshness sometimes of his father that was in relationship to what was happening with the power structure in Arkansas. As a historian for 40 years working at the university, I came upon a number of discussions because I did my work in Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and knew much about the riots of the Red Summers of 1919 and what have you. And oftentimes, those summers are focused upon, St. Louis and Chicago and those kinds of places. But seldom does it go as deep as down into Arkansas. And so I had a chance to really look into some things in Arkansas and ran across Elaine, Arkansas, and discovered that in 1919, Elaine, Arkansas had the worst race riot of any state in the nation. It was considered the deadliest race riot in the United States, deadlier than what happened in Oklahoma and all the other places. And it's interesting that has never really been, it's now being researched and looked at, but I had to begin to ask myself what impact probably did the race riots of 1919 have on my grandfather, not far from that in Arkansas. Because in that race riot, not only did the incident occur for that moment, but it went from about a month of people really tracking people down in the fields and the cotton fields and the various other areas and basically murdering them. And hundreds of African Americans were murdered during that time to strike a sense of fear in those who were in Elaine, Arkansas. And many people ran and went various other places. But the word of what happened in Elaine was a chilling effect across Arkansas. My father was born in 1918, the year before that, and he had several brothers and sisters before him. So obviously his father, who had been a sharecropper in Arkansas for many years, and his grandfather, who had been enslaved in Arkansas, Oliver Nash, saw the impact of Elaine, Arkansas, and it created tremendous amount of fear and deference that you just can't rise up, you can't raise those issues, you just can't do those things because the consequences, not only for that person, but for their entire family could be devastating. And they understood the viciousness of Jim Crow. And so when my father, obviously in 1951, decided to challenge what was happening at the way stations, it was very reminiscent of what had happened in Elaine, Arkansas. In Elaine, Arkansas, they were trying to organize the sharecroppers to get better wages for what was happening and fairer weights for themselves at the way station. Because the current system was you could pretty much, if you were a shareholder, if you were a landowner and had people sharecropping for you, you could basically charge them anything you want. You could weigh it and you could basically cheat them out of their wages, which is what often happened. And people knew how hard they worked from year to year and end up with less money every year. And so this was the issue that my father was raising and confronting those whites at the way station. And obviously, everyone talked about the fact that it sent chills throughout Hope, Arkansas, because of the fear that would happen to not only him, but eventually his family and others. It was in that spirit and in that concern that obviously my father fled Arkansas, had to be taken out of Arkansas in the middle of the night, put in a bed of a wagon, taken to a train station in Texarkana, and then sent to my grandmother, my mother's mother, who had left Arkansas some years before. to California. So my father came here with a tremendous amount of obviously bitterness and anger towards the South in terms of what it had done to him, but more committed and determined to make sure that it did not happen to his children. Consequently, my father never allowed us to say yes, sir, no, sir, ever. And even to this day, it is difficult for me to say yes, sir, no, sir. I never say it. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. My dad said, if yes and no is not good enough, then nothing is good enough. And he refused to allow any of his children to ever say those words. And it's interesting because I wonder if we actually came from the South, particularly my older brothers and sisters who were 11 and 12 years old when they came to California, never had a sense of deference of yes, sir, no, sir, ever. Even to this day, and they're 80 years old, they've never actually said those words because that was a curse to my father to be able to do that, a sense of disrespect to you as a person. So my father had this kind of radical spirit about him. And some people asked if I didn't inherit that, and I'm sure we all did inherit some of that from my father. But it became real clear that he saw California as an opportunity. And so like so many Californians who came here, they came to California because California became the promised land. It was different than the South. And initially they thought it was better. And it was in one sense. It was better to the extent like most African Americans who went to the North, when you study the migration into the North of the country, and you look at the books that you study them in Marcus Garvey's era and what have you, people saw the difference that existed in the North and the South. And mostly what the difference it was is that you didn't have to live 24 hours a day under the same area or the same roof as someone white, that you had some flexibility. You could basically do what you wanted when you got off from work in the evening. You didn't have to have massa making you come to his house to serve his children, or him knocking on your door in the middle of the night to come do something for him because one of his children was ill. You didn't have to have that 24-hour oversight as you had when you lived out in the country, that they could come to your house any time of day or night and make demands on you. When you lived in the city, you basically had your own neighborhoods, your own communities, and people were less likely to do that. Now, the police may come knocking on your door at night, but at least you didn't have the idea that the guy that you work for in whatever factory or whatever place you work was going to actually come into your neighborhood, make demands on your time and your space. And so in some sense, African Americans saw this as a sense of at least freedom with regards to their ability to have something in their own community. And as a result, they saw it as a better life. Now, clearly it was a better life, but it wasn't necessarily the same life as those who were white living in those communities. They didn't have the same level of opportunity. They didn't have the same kinds of things that they had. And even though they didn't have to deal with the signs of black and white signs in terms of the de jure racism, we had to deal with de facto. The fact that the structure of the society was of such that it did that. And so in California, de facto segregation and discrimination was as insidious as really de jure. It was sometimes more difficult for people to talk about it, to quantify, but surely it had elements of it that basically disempowered communities, and the way in which our communities were structured took away some of the things that we would normally have had. We talk about the fact that school segregation existed in California. And people thought it didn't initially because they only looked at the fact that they didn't have a sign, that there wasn't a law that said you couldn't. But there were things that were done even down to the Melendez lawsuit that basically happened 8 years before Brown versus Board of Education, that really talked about how Latino children were treated in schools and how African American children were treated in schools. And so what you had was a housing pattern and a gerrymandering of housing patterns that allowed school districts to create for themselves these segregated schools. And so those of us, myself included, who went to schools in California, who went to California schools, found ourselves in segregated schools, living in segregated housing projects. I lived in the Pueblos. The Pueblos had just opened as an opportunity. We lived in the Pueblos, and it was, when you compare it to the fact that we lived in a 2-room shanty in Hope, Arkansas, and then moved to a small place in the Trinity Elementary School area, moving to the Pueblos into the projects where you have a house with 4 bedrooms and you got 8 kids, 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. standard, and some space to breathe, some grass, some areas to run and to play and what have you. You know, it looks like a great place to be because of that. But what it did do, obviously, is totally segregate that Black population away from everyone else. The big red track that ran on the track near Long Beach and 52nd Street basically kept that community encapsulated there. And as a result, growing up in Los Angeles, you have the experience of being in a very closed, not close, but closed community where you basically, your school was all Black. I went to all Black elementary school. My neighborhood was all Black. There were no one there but Black people. Latinos lived in East LA. We lived in South Central LA, very south as well as in Watts. And so as a result, those communities, those neighborhoods could be easily isolated with limited resources and limited opportunity. When I was in elementary school in the 50s, no one could teach in those schools other than Black people. They did not allow Blacks to teach anywhere other than in those particular schools. And so for me as a kid growing up, I saw nothing but, I saw Black teachers, I saw Black administrators. Well, I didn't see Black administrators. The principals were still all white. But I saw all of the folks that are in my community. It was a closed community that was basically all white in terms of teachers, students in the lower grades. When you got to middle school, you saw a couple of more individuals who were white. And by the time you got to high school, you saw a balance somewhat of Black and white teachers that were there. But the housing patterns were clear. That was clear in terms of where people lived. And the impact, of course, is that you end up having these communities that are basically all Black. Eventually, if you move out of those communities, you will find yourselves in a community that is integrated for a minute, and then it becomes all Black. Because when we moved out of the projects and moved over to 45th Street and between Broadway and Grand, there was probably 3 white people on the block, and probably before we knew it, there was everybody on the block was Black. You know, that they had all their children, their grandchildren had moved them out. And as a result, we end up basically with those things, the reality. California had covenants on many of their deeds that didn't allow you to sell them to African Americans. And those covenants now still exist, but they are no longer, you can no longer enforce them. And so what happens is that when you have this segregation, as in my school, you end up with a school that you can control the curriculum, you can control what people become, you can basically decide that the school has a large technical education program, very small programs that take people to college, very few counselors that take them to college, and basically people become technical individuals who become trained to do things. So the wood shop, metal shop, and those shops were probably the biggest thing in auto shops, were the biggest programs at Manual Arts High School at that time. The smallest programs had to do with college preparation. And it's interesting that college prep only became a major issue and a concern when we had the influx of immigrants from China in the 60s. When the political dynamics changed in China, we basically saw that the school curriculum began to accommodate the interest of the Chinese in higher education, or more importantly, the racism of the school board that they believed Chinese folks were smarter, even though they hadn't even been tested. And so these were the kinds of realities that you dealt with. When I graduated from Manual Arts High School, they used to have summer and winter classes. And so the summer class had 600 graduates, over 600 graduates. Of the 600 graduates, there were only about 10 of us in the college prep classes, 10 African Americans. The rest of the class was filled with Chinese immigrants, Chinese and Japanese immigrants. And the whole school, in the class of the 600, there were only 5 white people in the whole class. One of their fathers was from a professor at SC, and the rest of them happened to be immigrants who came in and who lived from Russia and other places, who lived in the Black community and sent their children to that school. But pretty much the white flight was common in the community. There were basically schools that, like I said, that were all Black and with very little accommodation for others that were there. And only at some point, it was interesting to me that when our communities, basically, people would we be there for a minute, we see the flight, we see people leaving. And the institutions that could not fly away, who could not get away, figured out ways to limit the impact of Black people. And I think of my, I talk about it not because I'm from UCLA, but I think about SC and SC being trapped in the Black community at that time. It had built its institution there. It had had meetings about moving SC out of South Central LA, but that was entirely too expensive because they had built some major buildings and facilities there. And so what happened, of course, as a result of community planning, you increase your visibility on the on the south side with the parks and the exposition park and so forth and so on. So you pretty much block people's ability to come in from there. You build some houses on the west side that were student housing, low income housing, some other housing over there that's new. You take the south side and you put some kind of marketplace down there that buffers SC. And the only other thing is right at the freeway, you put a hotel and you put the freeway right there. So the SC then becomes completely surrounded by other levels of development that really are not the same level of development that happens in the rest of the community in South Central LA. And so we saw this regularly, as a way to say that, this community may change, but there's certain things that will remain the same. When we talk about the voting population in Los Angeles in terms of how people were voted and divided, we continue to recognize the fact, as the prior speaker did, that there were a number of things that limited voting. And we, those of us who are in the assembly, as Mr. Bradford and Mr. Jones Sawyer here, have spent the last probably 8 years making sure that we change some of the dynamics of the process of voting, because even though California was much more liberal in its voting, it did very little to inform people about it. When I ran for the assembly, I had people who didn't know that if you were an ex-felon, you could vote in California. They thought an ex-felon was just like somebody in Mississippi and Florida and other places. You could not vote. In California, they could. Even those in Sacramento who were, as I ran across so many of the lobbyists and the lawyers, many of them did not know that you could vote as an ex-felon in California. It really shocked me when I presented a bill that made it required that they basically give information to folks who had finished their term that they had the right to vote. And of course, many of our prisons and individuals who didn't want to do it said it was too difficult to basically do that, and it was too expensive to simply say to a person who was leaving prison, you can now vote. They said it would require millions and millions of dollars to change all of their materials just to put this one line in that says you can now vote. So there was tremendous amount of resistance to doing that, even though that had been California law. We just removed the last piece, which is about the ex-felons, that those who are basically on parole can now vote in California. And we had that for many, many years, those that could not. And so this is a new thing that has happened. And in our office, we sent, I think, of 40 or 50,000 letters to people on parole who've been on parole for years, say you can now vote. Many of them had no idea that as a result of Prop 17, that they could vote. We sent that out. Some of them are ecstatic, finally got their ballots, and now are ready to vote. And we see, of course, that what has happened as a result of that is that this whole interest in voting among those who are in California and other places, we see, as pointed out, the number of bills that are now coming forward that are really working to keep people from voting in other states. Now, those bills don't come forward in California because California is a large Democratic population in its assembly and its Senate. However, right now, there is a proposition to be placed on the ballot to now talk about ID voting and requiring people to have an ID in order to be able to vote. And we know that that's one of the new terms that's being used. It's a Jim Crow law, pretty much like literacy test and everything else, that will limit the number of persons who even attempt to register to vote. And clearly it will limit those who show up at the polls to vote if they have to have certain levels of ID that some of them may or may not have, particularly those who are older and who don't have birth certificates, who don't have those things, but have other forms of identification that would allow them to be able to participate in the process. So we are constantly dealing with the fact that this whole issue of voting opportunity, California's redlining of things, has been a part of California's legacy, despite the fact that we have always kind of prided ourselves in being a little bit further along than others. If any of you have not, you should get a chance to see the movie, The Bankers, because it's a true story about how these gentlemen, two men, owned about a third of all of Los Angeles downtown. and how they lost that property through some manipulations and things that happened in courts and some things that were in Texas, and it's called The Bankers. And it was interesting to me when I looked at the movie, because when I looked at the movie, I recognized the two men who had actually been at the end of the movie that had actually been the bankers. They were men that I saw regularly in the Southwest Wave, the black newspaper in Los Angeles when I was a kid. And these were men in the 60s who actually owned a significant number of pieces of property in downtown LA, and they're called the bankers. But it also talks about all of the covenants and the things that occurred that prevented Black people from owning property, not only downtown, but owning property in the west portion of Los Angeles, what they now call the jungle and all those places. All those things were restricted from being used for their ownership. And the only way they could get it was to buy it through someone white, which made them vulnerable to be cheated by the man's wife when he died, in terms of, because they couldn't write the documents, they couldn't create the laws that, or the documents that would give them the opportunity. So when we began to look at this, I mean, those of us who lived in Los Angeles, we always think of ourselves as being much more fortunate, and we were than maybe some folks in the South somewhat. But the reality is the impact of the segregation, the impact of de facto laws, the fact that in fact there was ongoing discrimination. The fact that when I went to UCLA in the 60s, before, we looked up and there was 30-some thousand students at UCLA and only 300 Black students, and all of them, they were either and that included undergraduate, graduate, and graduate. I knew only probably the whole time I was at UCLA 3 Black professors in the whole, and that was through 3 degrees. 3 professors that were Black at UCLA. You see this and a slow evolution, the slow churn, and we see some more faces coming, but we see now a decline in the number of persons who are at those institutions. It is clearly a continuing struggle in California, I think, to live up to what it perceives itself to be as this wonderful dream that has equal opportunity and access for all. This commission has an opportunity to address those issues, hopefully to provide some permanent solutions so that we don't find ourselves in another 50 years from now having a conversation about reparations. Thank you so very much for inviting me to be with you.